Katie. I'm currently really nothing. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I worked for both marijuana enforcement and the Department of Agriculture in a small environmental consulting firm for this. So now I just sort of use this as a soapbox, I guess, to inform people in the public about some of the issues I've seen as an employee of these agencies. So I guess I should ask, how many of you have ever been in a cannabis cultivation facility? One, two of you. Okay, all right. So I'm going to talk pretty much specifically about pesticides as it relates to cannabis, including hemp. There's some just differences that I'll touch on, but for the most part it applies to both. So first question is, what is a pesticide? How many of you have studied FIFRA? Any of you? None of you. Okay, so a pesticide, you figure Roundup, right? Stuff to kill bugs. That's all true. So Colorado has a definition that's pretty similar to EPA. Essentially, it's any mixture, substance designed to kill, mitigate, repel any pest. There's some other stuff in here you don't really need to worry about. Defoliants. Doesn't include animal drugs, so if you're treating your dog for worms, that's regulated differently. So if I mix vinegar and something together to pour on my weeds in my lawn, is that a pesticide? The answer is yes, it's just not regulated. So there's a line of regulation that applies, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But what you need to know is essentially anything designed to mitigate or kill is a pesticide. So in cannabis, you often see insecticides, fungicides, those are kind of the biggest ones. They also deal with mites and their eggs, and then also algae. So we've seen a lot of anti-algicide products being used as well. So the issue with this is that because, and I'm going to talk mostly about marijuana, marijuana is not federally legal, and so because of that, the studies haven't been done in order for pesticide manufacturers to put marijuana on their labels. So the problem with that is there's no safety data, there's no information about, hey, this is how much you can apply to cannabis in this environment. So EPA a few years ago said, hey, we can do this through experimental use permits and different types of permits. And what you need to know is to date that hasn't happened. Now with the legalization of hemp, we're going to start seeing that happening. There are some in the process of trying to get approved, but it's going to be pesticides that are already allowed by the label. And you'll see this a few times in here, but if I can teach you one thing about pesticides, even if you're just using it at your house, is the label is the law. If it has an EPA registration number, that means you have to read the label and you have to follow what the directions tell you. So the problem with this is because there's no federal oversight and there's no label specifically for cannabis, it creates a real public health crisis that I think a lot of people don't know about, and it also poses worker safety challenges. So the states, including Colorado, have had to come up with their own sets of rules on how to deal with this, and over the last few years, Colorado basically said, we're just going to follow what FIFRA says. If the label is broad enough, where it says you can use it on all plants, cannabis growers, you can use it. Other states have adopted things like if it says herbs or specific crop groups, you can use pesticides. That's ridiculous. Marijuana is not an herb. Marijuana is not other different types of crops. It's its own agricultural commodity. So again, labels the law. Colorado went one step further to protect workers and consumers, and they passed this rule in 2017 or so. They basically said, hey, you also can't mix together your own products and use them. So compost tea is a common thing that you may have heard of in organic production. Cannabis growers can't use them because we don't really know how that's affected on the plant. And we just, we, the state, essentially don't want people mixing things together that can't be tested. And so CDA does regulate hemp cultivation, but they don't regulate anything after cultivation. So again, there's this kind of regulatory black hole. Hemp being any plant of cannabis that has 0.3% or less THC is hemp. Anything over is marijuana, even though it's the same plant. EPA's role is essentially, like I said, the regulation and registration of pesticides. Colorado also has their own registration process. So just something for you to know in case you ever get into pesticide world. The important thing to note here, and this is from the Cannabis Safety Institute, is essentially what I just said. There's no safety data. You can't use pesticides on a plant or on a crop that isn't specifically labeled for that crop. And so how do you do that when cannabis isn't a crop that's allowed? Basically, like I said, follow the label. So what this means for growers is it puts them in a position of being dependent on pesticide use. without any guidance. The only guidance that they really get is from CDA, basically saying, here's this list of pesticides that are not a violation of the label to use. Go read the label and figure out how to apply it. Many of these growers have never grown a plant of any kind in their life. They have no idea what they're doing. They came from basements. And so we're seeing a lot of issues with people understanding how to apply this law and how to read labels and how to apply pesticides. The other issue, and you'll kind of see this a little bit later, is that marijuana is a huge moneymaker. And so using illegal pesticides, if you have an outbreak of powdery mildew, you might risk losing all of your crop and potentially your business. Is it worth it to use an illegal pesticide and maybe not get caught? The answer is yeah, a lot of them are doing it. So labs are another area of licensing that has some issues related to pesticides. They don't have a lot of guidance on what to test for or how to test. State agencies have said, here's your guidelines for what you need to meet, the criteria that you need to meet in order to become a licensed lab to test for pesticides and other contaminants on marijuana. The problem is that the 2 and 3 state agencies that created these rules didn't work together very well. And so because of this lack of teamwork and collaboration between these state agencies, there's a huge lapse in what private labs are testing for. I don't know if that's next or not. We'll get to that in a second. So CDA, if you're under investigation as a cultivation, we come out and we sample and we say, hey, we're gonna test all of these leaves, we're gonna test all these flowers. It's getting screened for 170 pesticides, 2 different types of equipment. If you, as a grower, send your leaves and plant material off to a private lab, it's getting screened for 13. That's it. So that leads to a whole, I guess, area of public health concern that a lot of people just aren't familiar with. Another issue with sampling requirements and testing requirements for cultivations is that, and I've been told this by growers, if you know when CDA is coming in or you know when MBD is coming in, you just keep 5 or 6 plants in the corner that you never spray with pesticides, you collect your samples from there. Meanwhile, we're spraying everything we're not supposed to be on the rest of our plants. So we call those clean rooms, seeing it happen. There just isn't really good regulation on who's sampling and who should be sampling. So it's the fox guard in the hen house. When there are failures of pesticides at the lab, they are obligated to report it in a system called Metric. It's their seed to sale program. However, once it's reported, nobody's checking on that. So me as a lab, I report this failure. I'm supposed to tell the grower or the dispensary, don't sell this product, but the state agencies are never checking that. One of the most important things from my perspective that's being done is that growers are starting to use minimal amounts of pesticides, whether or not they're legal or illegal, which is fine, except for it leads to resistance. So we're starting to see resistant strains of mites, resistant strains of molds, resistant strains of all kinds of things. And so that doesn't just affect cannabis, especially in areas where there's other agricultural commodities like melons. You get a resistant strain of powdery mildew, you're working in the cultivation on Monday and you go to your uncle's watermelon farm on Tuesday, you've now transferred that resistant strain to traditional ag crops. So this is my soapbox a little bit, and I'll try to hurry up here a little bit. But essentially, if I can summarize this in just small terms, I guess. MBD and CDPHE and CDA, in some respect, created a set of rules, created tolerances. Tolerances are the amount of pesticides that are allowed to be on foods after a pesticide has been applied. So every food that you eat, if it is allowed to have pesticide on it, there's a limit that they are allowed to be under. MED has essentially gone and created their own tolerances for marijuana. They said that if you use these illegal pesticides and they're under this amount, that's fine. We can go ahead and sell that. That decision, that rule is a violation of FIFRA, federal law, state law, which is the Pesticide Applicators Act, and their own law, because it's incorporated in there, and an executive order written by Governor Hickenlooper. So this is the rule 712. There's actually 2 because it's for medical and recreational. But this basically tells you that they allow permissible limits of these 13 or 14 pesticides. These 14 pesticides are not allowed for use on marijuana because of the label. All of these products, very clearly only allowed for ornamental products or for use around the house, stuff like that, not allowed for foods. So that's a problem. The executive order that Governor Hickenlooper wrote basically required the 3 agencies to work together to collaborate to prevent contaminated marijuana from getting to consumers. Until scientific assessment establishes which pesticides can be safely applied, the Department of Health needs to consider it contaminated and it needs to be destroyed. I can tell you right now, that's not happening. How am I on time?
You got about 16 minutes.
Oh, all right, okay, fine. So, 3 agencies here to protect you, here to protect workers, not really doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if you consume marijuana, I'm hoping this is scaring you because that's the intent, because people need to know. So, I know, and I'm probably one of only a few people that know, that Colorado is likely to undergo some changes here in the future about whose responsibility it's going to be to protect the public from consuming this contaminated marijuana. Right now you have CDA who regulates pesticides and only the pesticide use. You have MED that regulates the marijuana and contaminated marijuana, and then you have CDPHE who kind of sort of regulates contaminated marijuana. Well, there's emails and there's conversations that basically say MED wants nothing to do with regulating contaminated marijuana. CDPHE wants nothing to do with regulating contaminated marijuana. So, I think the email's coming up here. We'll go to the email first really quick. So this is a summary of a couple of employees to the Commissioner of the Department of Agriculture summarizing a meeting between the 3 agencies that discusses exactly what I just told you. The agencies are trying to figure out a way where they can wash their hands of having to regulate any contaminated marijuana under their rules. They want CDA to do it, which is great, and I'd be all for it, except for it's not reasonable. It's not written that way in law. We could do it via memorandum of understanding or some other agreement. Where's that money going to come from? What does that look like? That changes the entire structure of how contaminated product in the state is being regulated. We don't do that with other products. Why are we going to do it with marijuana? The other thing that's to note here, one of the division directors or director of CDPHE in the past has requested that CDA loosen their guidance and their guidelines on what products, what pesticides are allowed to be used on cannabis. Much of the industry groups, and some of the state agencies believe that it's too stringent. They'd rather that we don't follow the law, they'd rather that CDA don't follow the law, and just sort of make it easier for people to use pesticides that may not be allowed. Again, this is a huge problem because we don't know safety data. So, I just want to be very clear from my perspective as a compliance person, somebody who's been doing compliance for 10 years, CDPHE very definitely has the authority to be able to regulate this and to be able to prevent contaminated marijuana from being sold. It's under their Colorado Food and Drug Act. Now, they may make the argument, hey, well, marijuana is federally illegal, we can't touch it. They're making the same argument for hemp. Hemp is now legal. So if you're the type of activist that wants to make sure that people are protected, this is where you need to be paying attention, because very clearly in their law gives them the authority to do this, and they're not doing it. So why does all this matter? One of the arguments here all the time is, well, people use pesticide on foods, and the ditchweed from the 70s, that had paraquat on it and all kinds of pesticides. Yes, that's true, but we voted for it, we passed it, and it's supposed to be regulated like alcohol, like tobacco. People should be protected from the products that they're buying. So, like I said, not a lot of studies being done, but Colorado Green Lab did a study in, I think, 2017, 16 maybe, on cannabis and a particular pesticide called Eagle 20, which is myclobutanol. It's a fungicide. Very popular, very good product, works really well. The problem is, it's not allowed to be used on cannabis. So essentially the summary of their findings is that if you apply myclobutanol to cannabis, it's at least found 21 days later in pretty high amounts. And when you ignite it, the pyrolysis study shows that hydrogen cyanide is created as a byproduct. So people are inhaling hydrogen cyanide. Not necessarily large amounts, but something that shouldn't be there. So some of you might be sciencey nerds. This is the heat exchange and how the decomposition happens. So another important point is extraction. So you don't just smoke marijuana, you also apply it. You can use it as tincture, you can use it as suppository, you can eat it in a brownie, whatever, right? So the extraction for oils is very similar to extraction for testing for pesticides. And this particular study found that with this type of fungicide, the plant material, whatever was on the plant material at the time of testing, was found at 250 times greater amount in the oils at the end of extraction. And that's not just true of these fungicides, that's true with other products, other pesticides as well. So while during testing at the private labs, something may not show up on a leaf or on a flower, it may actually end up in the end product, and oftentimes does. So some other tests here, these were done a little bit earlier, 2015. I believe this is the Cannabis Safety Institute as well. Oregon found that 5% of concentrates had levels up to 100,000 parts per billion of these illegal pesticides. Chlorphenapir, which is one I want to touch on, it's a relatively new insecticide. It has been found on marijuana in Colorado, and it's not being screened for at private labs. Okay? So in Pakistan, there was an argument between a brother and I think it was two brothers or a guy and a business partner at their bakery. One of them put chlorphenapir in the dough and killed 34 people. Oral exposure we know is fatal. They've had, there's been one case of inhalation, not in Colorado, but one case of inhalation exposure to be fatal. And then most recently in 2018, the Hong Kong Journal of Medicine found that this 40-year-old man who, I think he fell into a solution of 10% chlorphenapir died 5 days later. So this is not something that we really want workers using without proper procedure, and it's not something you want to be consuming. But it's here. This is a sample sheet from an investigation from a couple of years ago. And this is only one. This is only one of the many samples. And it wasn't just found on the leaves, like, hey man, nobody's going to eat these leaves, they're just going to get tossed away. This was on flour. This was on product that was ready to be trimmed and sold. So, not to be all hum and glum, but it's important that you know these things. There's issues with how cases are getting referred because of this lack of collaboration between the state agencies. Cases have gone missing in marijuana enforcement division. So every pesticide case, whether or not it be worker protection or just a misuse, that gets referred to the other two agencies, to CDA, to CDPHE and MED. Cases have gone missing. The way that MED stipulates agreements with licensees, they require second sampling, which is, I guess the best way to explain is not good procedure for determining if contamination still exists. And additionally, if you were to grow apples or oranges or whatever and you misuse a pesticide, your products get destroyed. This is the only industry that gets a pass. Why are we allowing that, especially when we don't have the health data? In my opinion, there's still too many completely unqualified businesses with not enough enforcement. Now, that's not necessarily the agency's fault. They don't have enough people, don't have enough money. The low finding authority, if you're a grower and you misuse a pesticide the first time, the CDA is going to give you a cease and desist order. Slap on the wrist, that's it. Your second one, unless there's something really egregious, you're getting a $200 fine. You don't care about that because your plant is $4,000 per plant, right? Some of you guys have hundreds of thousands of plants. So enforcement's necessary when you have bad actors. The problem is it's not good enough. It's not good enough to make people change. So this is an example. This is a list, and this is not super updated, but essentially this is a list of referrals from CDA to MED and what the outcomes were. So the blue you need to know is essentially that at least there was voluntary destruction or partial destruction. And then the green is sample stipulations where CD goes back out and resamples. And even if the material was contaminated originally, if it comes back as a non-detect, it's still getting released. It doesn't mean the pesticide's not there, it's just no longer detectable. That doesn't mean that the side effects are still going to be there. And then the resolution unclear is cases that went missing. So I'll just touch on worker safety briefly. The one good thing about all of this is that no matter what happens with the consumer protection standpoint, pesticide use in terms of worker protection will always be regulated by the Department of Ag. But that's only if the growers are using pesticides that obligate them to be protected. So moving forward here really quick, not all pesticides have this box, okay? That's called what we call an ag use box. An ag use box is a box that tells the establishment, that tells the grower, you have to do these things and follow this law. The worker protection standard is like tax law. It's awful. It's terrible to read, hard to interpret, but that's what requires workers to be protected. The problem is the attrition of employees in cannabis grows is terrible. There's some people that work there a week, they're gone. 2 weeks, they're gone. And so training and retraining these people has become a real issue. So CDA does go out and do compliance assistance, they do inspections, they do their enforcement. This is where I want to touch on hemp. So hemp registrants from 2014, they were at 300. It has jumped to over 1,200 as of today. There are, I think, right now, six inspectors to do those inspections. You think they're all getting done? You think they're all getting done well? Getting done as best they can, but that leaves a huge lack of oversight for workers who have never experienced how to apply pesticides. Lots of exposure potential there. So worker protection standard violations, that's things like not notifying people, not providing respirators, not providing the right equipment. 2016-17, there were only 14. That's not bad. I can tell you that's because there weren't very many inspections. 2017 and 18, it jumped to 99. And then most recently, this most recent fiscal year, we went down to 69, which is pretty good. You think people were starting to get the hang of it. Maybe they understand how to read labels, know what they're doing. But that's still 69 potential single exposures to workers. So out of all of the hundreds of applicants and licensees, I guess that's pretty good. Should be less. So the common violations are respirators. So not all pesticides require respirators. It's just the way it is. The problem is when they are required, they're not being provided, they're not being warned correctly, people aren't getting the right testing, they're not keeping the right and required paperwork. Entry restriction is another big one, and Syngenta just got in trouble for this, but letting people enter treated rooms that they're not supposed to be, that's common, happens all the time. And then notification and posting. So another issue is you can go to Home Depot or whatever and buy your home rose and garden spray, and it might say for use on flowers, so you could use it on cannabis, but it says only for home gardens. People are using that all the time too, and you think it's, it is what it is, it's the same product, but you have to follow the label. If you don't follow the label, it's a violation of the law. It's just as simple as that. So Syngenta got in big trouble a couple years ago. This was out in Hawaii. It was actually during, or right before one of their inspections from EPA, or it might have been the state. Workers were in the field, they got sprayed with a pretty toxic pesticide. 10 of them had to go to the hospital. In the end, essentially Syngenta was supposed to be fined $4.8 million, and they negotiated it down to $150,000. So it's not just cannabis where people are getting away with stuff. Just real quick, MUD 2000 update, and Marty touched on this. Mold is a big problem. Mold's getting out into the environment, into workers' lungs, into your lungs if you're consuming and smoking. But for me, as a pesticide person, this means that there's going to be more applications of pesticides, right? So more potentials for exposures of pesticides. And keep in mind that these numbers are only for private labs. And I told you what the issue with that is. So essentially, I don't want it to be all negative. There are ways that these programs can be successful. It really needs to take these agencies to be collaborative and work well together. And I think that's maybe starting to happen a little bit better than it was. And industry needs to be honest. How many of you were here for the woman who was from the industry group that presented? Anybody? One. Okay. I'm a little biased, but I can tell you that the industry and the industry groups, for the most part, especially the big players, they don't care about you as consumers. They don't care about their workers. So it's relying on growers and owners being honest. And education. Our agencies that do enforcement need to make sure that they aren't just enforcing, they're educating, because education begets compliance. And lastly, like I said, I think a little bit higher finding authority, especially when you have violations of worker safety and public health. It's different than just having a rules violation where you didn't sign your name on a sheet or something. These need to be treated very punitively, make sure that people aren't continuing to do them. And essentially doing regular facility assessments as growers themselves and from agencies, and then making sure that our licensees are treating their workers as assets, not just as people who are there to work. I know that's a lot to go through. Thank you.